The autumn of 1918 on the Western Front was characterized by a grinding, industrial lethality that had stripped warfare of its romanticism. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive, launched in late September, was the grand finale of the American Expeditionary Forces, AEF, involvement in the Great War. It was a campaign designed to break the Hindenburg Line by severing the German logistical artery known as the Decauville Railroad. The strategic objective was clear: cut the rail line, starve the German armies in the north of supplies, and force a capitulation. However, the tactical reality on the ground was a nightmare of terrain and entrenched defense. The Argonne Forest was a natural fortress, a labyrinth of steep ridges, dense thickets, and ravines that the German command had fortified with interlocking fields of machine gun fire. Into this crucible stepped the 82nd Division, a unit known as the All-Americans, because its ranks were filled with draftees from every state in the Union. Among them was the 328th Infantry Regiment, and within that regiment was a man who represented a profound paradox of the American military experience: Corporal Alvin York. To understand the events of October 8, 1918, one must first analyze the psychological and administrative trajectory of Alvin York. Born in the remote mountains of Fentress County, Tennessee, York was a product of a subsistence culture where marksmanship was a requisite skill for survival, not a martial discipline. His early life had been marked by turbulence, fighting, and social instability, but a significant personal transformation in 1915 led him to adopt a rigid ethical code that strictly forbade violence. When the draft notice arrived in 1917, it precipitated a collision between York's moral constitution and the requirements of the state. York filed for exemption as a conscientious objector, CO. His rationale was not based on political dissent, but on a fundamental philosophical imperative that the taking of human life was unjustifiable under any circumstance. The selective service machinery, however, operated on bureaucratic classifications. York's specific sect was not on the government's list of recognized peace churches, and his application was denied. The resolution of this internal conflict occurred at Camp Gordon, Georgia, and it provides critical context for York's behavior in battle. He was not a reluctant soldier in terms of capability. He was physically robust and a master marksman, but he was psychologically inhibited from killing. The intervention came through his battalion commander, Major George Edward Buxton, and his company commander, Captain E.C.B. Danforth. Major Buxton, a New England intellectual, engaged York in a series of discussions that were less about military discipline and more about moral philosophy. They debated the nature of civic duty and the ethics of defensive violence. Buxton posits that war, while intrinsically horrific, could serve a higher, moral function if it preserved the integrity of the state and protected the innocent from aggression. He argued that the soldier is a peacekeeper of the last resort. This dialectic process allowed York to reconcile his pacifist ethics with his military obligations. He concluded that if fighting could end the war and save lives, it was a necessary burden. He withdrew his objection, not because he learned to love war, but because he accepted it as a grim duty. By early October, the 82nd Division had relieved the 28th Division and was tasked with assaulting the German positions near Châtel-Chéhéry. The terrain was dominated by Hill 223 and Hill 244, high grounds that offered the Germans command of the valley floor. The German defense was anchored by the Landwehr regiments, older reservists and veterans who were battle-hardened and proficient in the use of the MG-08 machine gun. The mission assigned to the 2nd Battalion of the 328th Infantry for the morning of October 8th was to seize the Decauville Railroad. To do so, they had to advance across a valley roughly 3 kilometers wide, flanked by ridges infested with machine gun nests. Intelligence reports indicated that the German morale was flagging, but their defensive doctrine remained lethal. They utilized a defense in depth, allowing attackers to enter a zone before unleashing enfilading fire from concealed positions. As the sun set on October 7th, the men of G Company prepared their equipment. They carried the standard kit of the AEF, but there were critical discrepancies in weaponry that would play a decisive role in the coming engagement. While the M1903 Springfield was the iconic American rifle, many units, including York's, were issued the M1917 Enfield, a robust weapon derived from a British design. Additionally, the squad automatic weapon available to them was the French Chauchat, a notorious device plagued by reliability issues in muddy conditions. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of individual agency in modern warfare. The 328th was walking into a trap, a kill zone, engineered by German cartographers and artillerymen, and the solution would not come from the high command, but from a patrol leader's desperate improvisation. October 8th, 1918, 06 hours. The dawn of October 8th did not bring light. It brought a gray, suffocating fog that lay heavy in the Air Valley. The dampness permeated the wool uniforms of the 328th Infantry as they waited in their jump-off positions. The plan called for a rolling artillery barrage to suppress the German positions on the ridges, a curtain of steel behind which the infantry would advance. But as the 0 hour of 0610 approached and passed, the barrage did not materialize, or it fell harmlessly off target due to the fog and poor coordination. Without artillery support, the infantry began their advance into the silent valley. The silence was a ruse. The German defensive strategy relied on patience. They waited until the American waves were fully exposed in the valley floor, separated from the cover of the trees by hundreds of yards of open ground. Suddenly, the ridges of Hill 223 and the surrounding heights erupted. It was not merely rifle fire, it was a coordinated deluge of heavy machine gun fire and artillery. The Germans had established interlocking fields of fire that covered every inch of the valley. Men began to fall in rows. Officers, easily identifiable by their movements, were targeted first. The advance disintegrated immediately. The survivors were pinned flat against the mud, unable to move forward or retreat. Platoon Sergeant Harry Parsons, commanding the 1st Platoon of G Company after the death of Lieutenant Stewart, realized that the unit was facing annihilation. The fire was coming primarily from a triangular ridge to the left flank, where a concentration of machine guns was enfilading the American line. Parsons made a battlefield decision that would alter the course of history. He could not communicate with the company commander, Captain Danforth. He had to act on his own authority. He ordered Acting Sergeant Bernard Early to take a patrol and flank the German positions. The objective was to silence the machine guns by attacking them from the rear, a maneuver that required navigating through the dense, enemy-held forest. Sergeant Early assembled a team of 17 men. It was a roster that reflected the diverse immigrant nature of the American Army, a fact often obscured by the singular fame of York. These men were drawn from the squads under Early's command. The patrol moved out in single file, slipping away from the carnage of the main line. They utilized the dense undergrowth and the fog to mask their movement, pushing deep into the German left flank. The terrain was treacherous, slippery mud, tangled roots, and steep inclines. They moved blindly, relying on the sound of the German guns to guide them. Their goal was to loop around behind the ridge and catch the gunners unaware. As they crested a rise and descended into a ravine behind the German lines, the patrol stumbled upon a scene of unexpected vulnerability. They had penetrated the German rear area, a zone considered safe by the enemy. In a small clearing along a stream, they found a large detachment of German troops. These were not the machine gunners, they were support personnel, stretcher bearers, and reserves who were eating breakfast and reading mail. The surprise was absolute. The Germans, assuming the Americans were pinned down kilometers away in the valley, were caught without weapons in hand. Sergeant Early signaled the attack. The Americans opened fire, but the engagement was brief. The shock of seeing enemy troops in their secure rear caused the Germans to panic. Hands went up. Cries of "Kamerad!" echoed in the ravine. In moments, the patrol had captured a massive group of prisoners. Estimates range from 70 to 90 men in this initial encounter. It was a stunning tactical coup. Sergeant Early, elated by the success, began to organize the prisoners for transport back to American lines. The Americans moved among the Germans, disarming them and lining them up. The tension was palpable. The prisoners vastly outnumbered the patrol, but the shock of the ambush held them in check. However, the ravine was not as isolated as it appeared. The machine gun crews on the ridge above, facing the valley, had heard the commotion behind them. They turned their guns 180 degrees, looking down into the ravine where the Americans were mingling with the German prisoners. The trap had not been sprung. The patrol had walked into the mouth of the beast. The narrative must now contract from the unit level to the individual perspective of Corporal Alvin York. While the patrol had achieved a collective success in infiltrating the rear, the next few minutes would strip away the collective strength of the unit, leaving York as the primary agent of action. The geography of the ravine was critical. The Americans were in the low ground, intermixed with the German prisoners. The German machine gun positions were on the slope above, roughly 30 yards away, concealed by brush and entrenched positions. The gunners on the hill were commanded by Lieutenant Paul Lipp, responsible for the heavy MG-08 emplacements that had been devastating the valley. The trigger for the massacre was a single vocal command. From the ridge above, a German officer shouted a warning in German. Accounts suggest it was a command to "get down," or a signal to clear the line of fire. The German prisoners in the ravine, understanding the language and the implication, instantly dropped flat to the ground. The Americans, many of whom did not speak German or were slow to react to the foreign command, remained standing for a fatal second. The machine guns on the ridge opened fire. It was a point-blank execution. The air in the ravine was instantly saturated with 7.992 mm rounds. The initial volley was devastatingly effective. Sergeant Bernard Early, the patrol leader, was hit by multiple rounds and critically wounded, effectively removing him from command. Corporal Murray Savage was killed instantly, his body torn apart by the volume of fire. Corporal Otis Merrithew, cutting, was severely wounded. 6 other privates, Domowski, Weiler, Waring, Wine, Can, were killed or mortally wounded in the initial seconds. The patrol had been decapitated. Of the 17 men, 9 were down. The remaining survivors, Privates Beardsley, Donahue, Konotsky, Sock, Wills, and Sakina, scrambled for cover. They dove behind trees or, in a desperate bid for survival, huddled behind the prone bodies of the German prisoners, using the enemy soldiers as human shields against the fire from the ridge. They were pinned, their weapons useless, their field of vision restricted to the mud and the terrified prisoners around them. Alvin York was positioned on the extreme left of the patrol's line when the firing started. This positioning was accidental but decisive. He was slightly separated from the main cluster of prisoners and Americans, placing him in a defilade position relative to some of the guns but exposed to others. York dropped into the mud. He did not panic. The chaos that paralyzed the others seemed to clarify his focus. He assessed the situation. The machine guns were traversing, sweeping the ravine floor. The German infantry on the ridge were beginning to fire rifles and toss grenades. The noise was deafening, a mechanical roar that drowned out individual thought. Crucially, York was the only American in a position to return effective fire who was not dead or suppressed. The German gunners, having neutralized the main group, began to hunt for stragglers. They spotted York. Bullets began to chew up the earth around him, snapping through the brush and striking the trees inches from his head. York realized that to stay prone was to die. He needed to engage the threat, but he was one man against a fortified ridge occupied by approximately 35 machine guns and dozens of riflemen. The mathematical probability of survival was near zero. Yet York possessed a specific set of skills and a specific weapon that would allow him to defy the probability. The legend of Sergeant York often depicts him with the M1917 Springfield rifle, a myth perpetuated by the 1941 film and the rifle's status as the standard American arm. However, forensic evidence, unit records, and York's own diary confirmed that he was armed with the U.S. rifle, caliber .45, model of 1917 Enfield. This distinction is not merely pedantic, it is vital to understanding the mechanics of the firefight. The M1917 Enfield was a heavier, more robust weapon than the Springfield. Crucially, it had a magazine capacity of 6 rounds, rather than the standard 5 found in the Springfield or the German Mauser. That single extra cartridge per reload would provide York with a sustained rate of fire that confused the enemy. Furthermore, the Enfield utilized a PEEP rear aperture sight, which allowed for faster target acquisition in the dynamic, low-contrast environment of the forest than the open-leaf sights of the Mauser. York adopted a fighting stance that was unorthodox for trench warfare but native to the Tennessee woods. He did not dig in. He utilized a technique of squatting or kneeling, moving constantly to avoid the traversing fire of the machine guns. The distance to the German positions was short, perhaps 30 yards. At this range, the battle was personal. York could distinguish individual gunners. The German MG-08 crews were struggling with the angle of depression. Firing downhill at a steep angle often exposed the gunners as they had to raise their heads to sight the weapon over the receiver and the water jacket. York began to fire. His method was deliberate. He did not suppress the area. He targeted specific threats. "Every time a head come up, I done knocked it down," York later recounted. The rhythm of the engagement became a deadly loop. A German gunner would pop up to locate the American rifleman. York, peering through the aperture sight of the Enfield, would fire. The heavy .30-06 round would strike the target. The German would fall. Another would take his place. York would cycle the bolt, a smooth cock-on closing action characteristic of the Enfield, and fire again. To the Germans on the ridge, the situation was baffling. They were pouring thousands of rounds into the ravine. They had neutralized the patrol. Yet they were taking precise, lethal fire from a single point. The volume of fire from the MG-08s should have been overwhelming, but York's accuracy was disrupting their operation. He was killing the gunners faster than they could effectively target him. York was also shouting. Between shots, he yelled at the Germans to come down and surrender. This behavior, killing with lethal efficiency while pleading for the enemy to stop fighting, reflects the internal duality of the man. He was not killing out of bloodlust. He was killing to stop the machine, to silence the guns so the killing could end. The German return fire was intense. Bullets pierced York's uniform and shattered his gear, but he remained, unhurt. The survivors on the ground, Private Beardsley, Private Donahue, watched in disbelief. Beardsley, whose Shoshai automatic rifle had jammed or was inoperable, could only witness York standing against the storm, engaging an entire company of infantry. York killed approximately 20 to 25 German soldiers during this rifle duel. He systematically dismantled the machine gun crews, moving his fire from one nest to another. The German command on the ridge, realizing that fire superiority was failing, decided to escalate the engagement. If bullets wouldn't stop him, bayonets would. By this stage of the engagement, the German morale was fracturing. The relentless accuracy of the American riflemen had created a zone of denial around the machine gun nests. Lieutenant Fritz Endres, commander of the 4th Company, 120th Landwehr, realized that the static defense was failing. He could not allow a single infantryman to pin down his entire command. Endres ordered a counterattack. He gathered a squad of men, accounts vary between 6 and 8 soldiers, and ordered them to fix bayonets. The plan was a classic infantry tactic, a rush. While the machine guns provided suppressing fire to keep the Americans' head down, the assault team would charge down the slope and close the distance, overwhelming the riflemen with superior numbers and cold steel. York saw the movement. He saw the gray uniforms rising from the trench line, the glint of the bayonets, and the rush of bodies down the slope. He knew instantly that his rifle was insufficient. The M1917 was a bolt-action weapon. Cycling the bolt, acquiring a target, and firing took time. With 6 men charging at a sprint from 25 yards, he would be overrun before he could fire 3 shots. York dropped the Enfield and drew his sidearm, a Colt M1917.45 ACP automatic pistol. The M1917 was a weapon designed for stopping power. It fired a heavy, slow-moving slug capable of knocking a man backward. It had a 7-round magazine plus 1 in the chamber. York employed a targeting strategy derived entirely from his civilian experience hunting wild turkeys. He knew that if he shot the lead man in a column, the others would see him fall, scatter, and take cover, making them harder to hit. To ensure the destruction of the entire charging group, he had to keep them unaware of the attrition for as long as possible. York aimed at the last man in the charging line. He fired. The man crumpled. The others, focused on the target ahead, did not immediately realize their comrade had fallen. York shifted aim to the next man from the rear. He fired again. One by one, the German assault team was dismantled from back to front. The pistol barked rhythmically. The heavy .45 caliber rounds were devastating at close range. The charging Germans were dropping in stride. Lieutenant Endres, leading the charge, was the last to be targeted. He had closed the distance significantly when York turned the pistol on him. York fired, striking Endres in the abdomen. The German officer collapsed in the mud, his bayonet useless, screaming in pain. The charge was annihilated. York had killed the entire squad with a single magazine of his pistol. The silence that followed the failure of the bayonet charge was absolute. The machine guns fell silent. The German infantry, witnessing the impossible destruction of their assault team, were paralyzed by shock. Lieutenant Paul Vollmer, the commander of the 1st Battalion, 120th Landwehr Regiment, had been observing the fight from his position near the command post. He was an experienced officer, a veteran of the Eastern Front, but he had never seen anything like this. He had watched his machine gun line decimated by a rifle. He had watched his friend, Lieutenant Endres, gutted by a pistol. Vollmer realized that the American soldier was not just a threat. He was an unstoppable force. Further resistance would only result in the extermination of his men. The psychological dominance of York was complete. Vollmer stood up. He walked unarmed down the slope toward York, navigating through the bodies of his own men. He approached the corporal, who was reloading his pistol, wary of a trick. Vollmer called out in English, "English?" He assumed that such professional lethality must belong to the British forces. York, breathing hard, adrenaline surging, replied simply, "American." Vollmer looked at the bodies on the slope. He looked at the terrified prisoners huddled in the ravine. He looked at York. "Good Lord," Vollmer said, "if you won't shoot anymore, I will make them give up." It was a surrender negotiated at the barrel of a gun. York agreed, but kept his weapon trained on the officer. Vollmer pulled a whistle from his tunic and blew a sharp signal. On the ridge, the remaining German defenders, approximately 30 to 50 men, stood up. They threw down their Mausers and walked away from their machine guns. They descended the hill, hands raised, joining the mass of prisoners in the ravine. The surrender of the ridge garrison created a logistical paradox. The fighting had stopped, but the danger had arguably increased. Corporal York, now the de facto commander of the battered patrol, found himself in possession of 132 German prisoners. The surviving Americans were outnumbered nearly 20 to 1. If the prisoners realized the fragility of their captors' situation, that they were being guarded by a handful of exhausted men deep behind enemy lines, they could easily overpower them. York recognized this danger immediately. He did not celebrate, he organized. He ordered the German officers, Lieutenant Vollmer, Lieutenant Max Thoma, 7th Bavarian Mining Company, and Lieutenant Paul Lipp, 125th Machine Gun, to the front of the column. This was a calculated psychological tactic. By controlling the officers, he controlled the enlisted men. York positioned himself immediately behind the officers, his Colt. Fouquet pressed against Vollmer's back. He issued a stark ultimatum. You march them, and if one of them makes a move, you die first. He also ordered the German prisoners to carry the wounded Americans, including Sergeant Early and Corporal Merrithew. This served a dual purpose. It evacuated his comrades and it occupied the hands and physical strength of the prisoners, reducing their combat potential. The return march was not a simple walk. It was a tactical movement through the kill zone in reverse. The column, a long snake of field gray uniforms, had to navigate the woods back toward American lines. As they moved, they encountered other German machine gun nests that were still active, unaware that their battalion headquarters had fallen. In each instance, York used Vollmer as a tool. He forced the German commander to blow his whistle and order the garrisons to surrender. Vollmer, defeated and wanting to avoid further slaughter, complied. The German gunners, seeing their own battalion commander held captive by an American, assumed the entire American army must be behind him. They threw down their weapons and joined the procession. York effectively bluffed his way through the remaining defenses, rolling up the German line from the inside out. The column eventually emerged from the woods and entered the American sector. The sentries of the 328th Infantry were stunned. The group of prisoners was so large it initially looked like a German counterattack. When the identity of the column was confirmed, the shock turned to disbelief. York halted the prisoners and reported to Brigadier General Julian Robert Lindsay. The general surveyed the scene, the piles of surrendered German weaponry, the line of 132 prisoners, and the ragged, mud-caked corporal standing at attention. "Well, York," Lindsay remarked, "I hear you have captured the whole German army." York, retaining the laconic humility of his mountain upbringing, replied, "No, sir, I got only 132. The tactical impact of the patrol's action was immediate and profound. By silencing the 35 machine guns on the ridge, York had removed the keystone of the German defense in that sector. The 328th Infantry was able to resume its advance, capturing the Decauville Railroad and forcing a German withdrawal from the Argonne Forest. However, the narrative legacy of the event became complicated. York was awarded the Medal of Honor and was catapulted to international fame as the greatest civilian soldier of the war. The media, particularly the Saturday Evening Post, latched onto the single-handed aspect of the story, crafting a myth of the solitary hero that resonated with the American public. This myth-making came at a cost. The other 16, the men who had walked into the ravine with York, faded into obscurity. Men like Bernard Early, who had led the patrol until his wounding, and Otis Merrithew, felt their contributions were erased. They had fought, bled, and died to make the flank maneuver possible. While York was undoubtedly the pivot point of the battle, the man who acted when others were suppressed, the initial infiltration and the prisoner management were collective efforts. In the years following the war, the Army conducted investigations and collected affidavits to verify the events. The testimony of privates like Patrick Donahue and Percy Beardsley confirmed York's singular role in the firefight, but also highlighted the presence of the group. The York spot was eventually identified and verified through forensic archaeology, locating the 45 casings and the German equipment, validating the tactical geometry of York's account. Alvin York returned to Tennessee not as a conqueror, but as a man burdened by the weight of his celebrity. He refused to capitalize on his fame for personal wealth, declining commercial endorsements. He remained true to his pre-war convictions, using his platform to fund education and infrastructure for the rural poor of his home county. The engagement of October 8, 1918, stands as a singular case study in military history. It demonstrates how the fog of war can create moments where the geometry of battle collapses to a single point: one man, one rifle, and a decision to fight. It was the resolution of York's internal paradox. The conscientious objector who became the war's most efficient killer, not out of hatred, but out of a desperate, lethal compassion to end the slaughter.